Holly. Anyway, I wanted to have a talk about Christmas decorations at these historic homes, primarily using natural materials. You know, think of holly boughs, magnolia leaves, wreaths, pine cones, that type of stuff. And I attempted to get a hold of some folks in historic Charleston at the various homes and museums, etc., and to provide us a speaker. And as I mentioned before Sue's talk, that's the hardest part of this deal, is getting a speaker to commit. And I just couldn't get anybody to commit, and I was commiserating one day, and she said, "Dad, I can do that." So she got elected. I think you're going to find this very enjoyable, but again, she's coming at it from a historical point of view, not necessarily a plant point of view. So don't ask her botanical questions because she can't answer. Have at it. I'll turn the light down.
Well, thank you for that introduction there, Dad. As you mentioned, my name's Mary, and of course, Bob's my dad, but we worked in museums, and my background is more in museum education and museum interpretation, so more about the how museums do what they do and why they do what they do based in the stories of history. So when I started this presentation, I was looking at it from, okay, do museums use real materials? And I had to do a little bit of research into that because I knew the museum I worked at does not use real materials. So looking into different places, I'm going to go through a couple different areas in the country. We'll talk about Williamsburg, Charleston, some of the Newport mansions, and you'll see that there's kind of a mix. And part of that is because we want to look at what a museum is. So I've highlighted some of those keywords up there, so researches, interprets. So the idea behind a museum is that we are trying to teach a lesson to the public. How many people have been to a museum in the last couple of months? Anybody? Did you learn anything?
Sure.
Did you have a good time?
Yeah, I did.
So that's what museums are for. They are nonprofits though, so any of the money that they bring in is put back into that museum to do better programming, to do more research, to provide grants for others to do research. And so with that, there's always this balance that you're having. There's different types of museums too. So you have science museums. A lot of those are going to be hands-on museums. Art museums mostly are going to be kind of just look only because it's artwork. And then you have historic house museums, which is where I've spent my career. And you have different methods with those too. Some house museums are very immersive and very first person, and they want you to be able to experience what life was like in whichever time period that house is interpreting. But then there's other historic house museums that have more of that hands-off approach too, where they might have a couple extra programs letting you hands-on experience, but most of the time it's kind of showing you what life was like, but you're not experiencing it. And that's the same with Christmas. So when we look at Christmas traditions, a lot of people think Santa Claus, Christmas tree, all of the greenery that's being used as decorations. They think of kind of that beauty of it. But realistically, Christmas is not it was never really a big decoration time period until the mid-19th century. So when we look at it, it goes all the way back to celebrating it on December 25th, goes all the way back to the Romans in the 4th century. They're really celebrating Saturnalia because Saturn is their god of agriculture, and they're giving this big celebration to him. But when we're looking at using holly in those decorations, that's also because that is an evergreen at that time period. So it's something that's still very beautiful at the end of the year. You have the pagan druids that are using it. They are believing that it is going to keep away evil spirits. You have the Celts who believe in a king holly and a king oak, and they believe that King Holly and King Oak fight twice a year, and Holly wins out for the midsummer, so he's ushering in kind of the season of less light, and that's when those hollies will start to grow a little bit towards the end of the year. And then you have also the Christians kind of adapted this idea of using the holly as one of their Christmas symbols as well, and they kind of have a mix of using some of these other traditions, and then also they play into the thorn crown that Jesus wore, and kind of use that kind of image to go with that. But when we're also talking about using that as decoration in the colonial days, it very much was minimal. They had a couple in sprigs of evergreen or holly in some of the window mullions. And that was really it. And that was kind of a way of bringing good luck, a symbol of renewal and new life coming in the new year. And that's what they would do. Sometimes they might have a little bit of evergreen sprigs throughout the house, maybe some on the mantle, but it's not these big, elaborate, full mantle decorations, that you see today. And it also depended on which part of the colony you lived in. So if you lived in the north or the south or the mid-Atlantic, you had a little bit of different traditions as well. Santa Claus, he's not until the mid-19th century. Christmas trees, mid-19th century. So none of that is going to be seen before the Revolutionary War, really. And then when we look at it, it's not even a national holiday until 1870. And that really became a federal holiday because of the banking schedule. And they wanted the day off. So some of the images that you think of course, the Christmas carols, the holly and the ivy, that is, the words go back more to the Middle Ages, but you don't really see it popularized until the 1800s. This public notice here, you'll notice the giant word forbidden. If you lived in Massachusetts Bay Colony, so if you lived in the Puritan colonies in the New England, it was forbidden to celebrate Christmas. In fact, this notice is put in the paper in 1658, and it's in effect this total ban of celebrating Christmas for at least a decade. And then they kind of lighten that up a little bit, but it's not until the early 1800s that you really see celebrations in New England kind of spike as much as they are in the southern colonies. And then this is just an image from that time period as well, but she's clearly picking some holly berries and bringing those in. They would sometimes put them on their clothes, a little sprig, and that was meant to be a sign of good luck. They used to think that if you planted a holly tree in front of your house, it would protect you from lightning, because the leaves of the holly would kind of take that lightning so it wouldn't get into the house and disperse it that way. So they believed all kinds of kind of crazy things. But this is what those decorations would have looked like. Very minimal, just in the windowsill, maybe a little bit of mistletoe on the ceiling. But that's it. This is from 1776. Most of the images we have from Christmas in the colonial days are from British engravings and prints. So this is actually from England, and that's because people talk about Christmas, but they don't necessarily draw pictures and paintings of it. So we look at historic references in diaries and letters that people are writing. And they're talking about the parties and the events, but they're not talking about the decorations. So we can see just that little bit. But it's mainly about the parties, especially in the South. So South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, they're having parties. And they're celebrating Christmas really over the whole 12-day period. So Christmas Eve all the way up to January 6th to 12th night. It's not just a singular event. They're going to church several times. They're visiting people. They are having big balls. They talk about having fox hunts, lots of get-togethers. But that's what they're celebrating. People get married during this season. This is one of the biggest seasons to get married in the colonial days. George Washington and Martha get married on 12th night, January 6th. Thomas Jefferson got married over that holiday period as well. So it's a big event to happen. This image here, again, that table, that's what they're focusing on. They're focusing on that feast and the food that they're having and that gathering. So this image is actually from another gentleman that you hear of quite often at this time period in October, Washington Irving, famous more for his Legend of Sleepy Hollow story, but he also has written several other books, one of which was Old Christmas, which was a story that he published in 1819, and that's where this image is actually from. This one is called, and it gives me a little chuckle, especially after my dad's talk last night or the other night about the rice culture. It's called Winter Holidays in the Southern States, a Plantation Frolic on Christmas Eve. This was published in 1857. It is incredibly inaccurate because if you see, you can see the enslaved persons are dancing, you have their white owners here having a good old time. As part of a museum, we want to tell the story of everybody that lived on those sites. So we're telling stories of the women that lived on the sites, the children that lived on the sites, including the enslaved persons that lived on those sites. So I wanted to include this image to kind of show that for the enslaved persons at Christmas, for those that worked in the fields, they might get a couple days off because it's not really a harvest time. So they may get a break. They might get a pass where they can go visit family members at other plantation sites. But for those that work in the house, it's going to be a busier time for them because of all those parties and feasts. There's a diary that's very famous in the historic world called Mary Chestnut's diary. She was living in Charleston during the Civil War, and one of the things that she writes about is several different years of Christmas celebrations. And one time she basically says, it's not that different. The carriages are coming and going, except that we're adding more food to the table. So it's just, you're increasing the amount of food that you're bringing in, but that's going to be those enslaved persons that are increasing that amount of food. And then we have the Christmas tree. So the Christmas tree is a German tradition. People, German families have been bringing Christmas trees in for centuries. It's not something new to them, but it's newer to Americans. So this image here, this is Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. This was published in the London Illustrated News in 1848. This is what popularizes the Christmas tree. This image gets Americanized, as they said, which really just meant they took off Victoria's crown and they took off Prince Albert's mustache. And it appears in Godey's Lady's Book, which is a mouthful, but that is a magazine that is very popular among women in the mid to late 1800s, and it popularizes a lot of the ideas and traditions that we think of in our country, one of which is the Christmas tree, because it gets published in that publication. It is geared towards women and helping them with all things in society. So kind of like a Vogue magazine today, that is one of those ones that people look to for new trends. It would post items of patterns for clothing, patterns for ladies' hats, things like that. So it was very influential. This one here is the first printed, there was other sketches drawn, but this is the first printed image of a Christmas tree in the United States. This was actually from 1836, but it was published in a book in Boston as the little front piece, and it was published again by a German gentleman. So that's where we kind of see this tradition come in. You notice the trees are kind of sparse, and that'll come up again a little bit later when we look at some of the house museums. The first Christmas tree that we see in Williamsburg is in the 1840s. It's a visiting professor, William & Mary, from Germany, and he puts up a Christmas tree there. The first one they talk about in Charleston is 1850. It's a Swedish singer named Jenny Lind. She is a celebrity of the time, and they say that she arrives on December 23rd, and then by Christmas Eve, people report in the newspaper seeing a decorated tree in her window of her hotel. Again, kind of like today, if it's good for the celebrities, it's good for me. People wanted to kind of start popularizing after that. Santa Claus, the famous poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. Clement Moore publishes it in 1823, anonymously in the Troy Sentinel in New York. He writes it for his kids, it's just a fun little poem. But then Thomas Nast publishes this image in January 3rd, 1861 in Harper's Weekly. Thomas Nast is a very famous political cartoonist. So this is really propaganda. It's a Union soldiers getting gifts from St. Nicholas, or from Santa Claus. But you have this idea of Santa Claus that kind of meshes with St. Nicholas, the patron saint of children. You have Washington Irving again is writing a story called The History of New York, where he talks about the Dutch figure of Sinterklaas, which kind of morphs into Santa Claus. And then later we have this image from Thomas Nast again, 1866. This is a little bit more what we think of with Santa Claus. We've got the workshop, we have the Christmas tree, the naughty and nice list. Those are some of those images coming together of what we really think of. And then this is published in 1881. This is Santa Claus in all his glory with his red suit, his big white beard, and a lovely little sprig of holly there on his head as well. So this is really where we get that. But again, this is 1881. So Christmas is not geared towards kids until the late 1800s. I'm sure you all probably know the history of the poinsettia plant better than I do, but I wanted to include this as well. So it came from Joel Poinsett. Obviously that is not the technical word, it would be this Quetzalcoatl, but it gets named after Mr. Poinsett, who was the ambassador to Mexico. He goes there in the 1820s, and he brings back a plant that he finds in one of the regions in Mexico. He picks it because it's blooming in December, and it's a beautiful plant. But the popularity doesn't really spike in the United States in terms of decorating until the late 1800s, and really in the early 1900s. There's a wonderful family, the Eck family. There was an article a couple years ago that they were selling the organization, but German immigrant. We have lots of German immigrants that are very influential in the holidays of what we think of with Christmas at least. And this family creates an empire in Southern California of growing poinsettia plants. At one point, they actually control 90% of the market for that particular plant. So you see that become the Christmas plant and the Christmas flower and start getting decorated using. Then we have mistletoe and kissing balls. So mistletoe is something that you see in images back into the colonial times, and you'll see these pictures of them climbing the tree to cut down the ball of mistletoe that is left after that deciduous tree loses its leaves. They also talk about them shooting those down with guns as an activity, or using a big hook to kind of cut them down. But the idea with the mistletoe is that it's the kissing plant. So they would hang it. If you had a big party or a ball, you would theoretically pluck a berry for every kiss. Once the berries were gone, no more kisses. And so that was a way for young ladies to get suitors to meet them as well. But it does become this big, beautiful decoration also. And so the idea of the kissing ball kind of develops over time from just being mistletoe and with maybe a little bit of holly sprigs into it too. And it starts to grow in the Victorian times with that whole Victorian language of flowers. And they can create an entire story with a bouquet of flowers. And so they start doing that with these elaborate kissing balls as well. So I've told you what Christmas decorations looked like in the colonial times. Just those couple of little sprigs, maybe some greenery. But this is what we think of colonial Christmas decorations, right? We think of Williamsburg and that Williamsburg Christmas look that they created. It was all created and fabricated by this woman, Miss Louise Fisher. She starts working in colonial Williamsburg in the 1930s. She is the hostess of the Raleigh Tavern, which is one of the first buildings to open in colonial Williamsburg. In the 1930s, the Rockefeller family takes a big interest and he puts a lot of money into it. They rebuild several of the sites at colonial Williamsburg to turn it into a living history museum. She starts making floral decorations for the tavern, and people kind of question, like, are these really authentic? Is this what they did in the 18th century? And so she did some research. She found these prints by Robert Ferber, who he does in 1730. He has a series of prints. There's one for each month of the year, and each one has all of the plants in it that are blooming or available in that month, and they're all labeled. So it kind of comes as a seed catalog as well, because it tells everybody what those plants specifically are. So she uses those for decoration, or for inspiration. Then she starts moving into a little bit more of the holiday time. So she looks to this Italian sculptor, Luca della Robbia, who is active in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and he's making these beautiful terracotta pieces with these gorgeous wreaths that are full of fruits and greenery around all of his images. So then she comes up with using all of those pieces to make these elaborate displays. And it starts to come as this Williamsburg look, as they would say. So again, this is the more traditional one. But when we look at how Williamsburg decorates, so Williamsburg does not do a lot of decorating inside the buildings. And part of that is because with any museum site, if it's an old building and it has old furniture, we don't want to bring a lot of live stuff in because that brings bugs. And bugs are very bad for anything that is made out of wood, especially old stuff. So we try to minimize that as much as possible. Also, if you have live stuff, you usually need water to keep it alive. And that can also be very bad for historic furnishing and buildings as well. But with Williamsburg, they start with dried materials, usually around this time of year actually. They'll start drying some of those plants. The flowers that they're using, that they're drying, are largely grown at the site, but they do source out all of the wreaths and all of the fruits. They're gonna buy those from wholesalers. They do grow, as my dad was saying the other night, they do grow the winterberry on site. They have a large plot of that they're growing and using. They use 10 to 12 volunteers is who does all of these wreaths and creates this. They have about 120 sites that they're actually decorating. So it's a lot of work for a couple people. But what they do is that somebody's gonna go around, somebody on staff will go around every single day, and they will inspect these wreaths, and they will look at them, and they will see if anything is rotting or wilting, and they'll pluck it out and put a new one in. So they're gonna refurbish these pretty much every day if it's necessary, because of that time that they're up during the year. So these are some of those beautiful displays that they have out there. They do use all those live materials on the outside, But the key is it has to be a material that was available and recognizable to somebody that was living in Colonial Williamsburg in the 1700s. So it looks like kind of some random things, but what you're not going to see are you're not going to see any electronic things, obviously, because they weren't around at that point. Also, I want to make it very clear that when you see some of these wreaths with fruits and things, there is not a chance that any colonial person living in Williamsburg in the 1700s is going to put fruit on their wreath on their door. If they have fruit, they're going to eat it. They are not wasting it for decoration. There are some fruits that are, of course, native to Virginia, but you're not going to have citrus fruits in December. They're definitely not grown in Virginia, so they're importing those, which is that extra cost. So you're not going to see those, but they would recognize them, so it's okay for them to use them in their decorations at Colonial Williamsburg. These pictures are from their contest that they do every year. It's apparently a very big deal. They say the Colonial Museum buildings, the trades buildings, so the blacksmiths, the printer shop, those all have their own decorations. And then there are residential buildings in Colonial Williamsburg that are rented by people who work for the foundation or volunteers of the foundation. So they all kind of have these different categories, and they do have these different contests, but I like these pictures that were posted. They were on their Facebook page last year because it tells you what they're using. So oyster shells, huge decoration. They're using the wheat, pomegranates, the pineapple. Pineapples are, of course, a symbol of hospitality, but again, not used for decoration in Colonial Williamsburg, actually historically. They're using the magnolias, a little bit of wool there because they have lots of sheep. Who knows what a milliner is? We all know what that is? Awesome. So they're making ladies' hats, which is why they have that beautiful silk fabric there, because that's about one of the few places that you're going to have those beautiful fabrics is going to be at a milliner's store. The tavern, using all of those cups there. This is probably the printer shop because it's all paper. They do have dried flowers in each of those little cones, but it's primarily paper. And then I had a chuckle the other night. I asked my dad what a shoemaker was called, and he said, a cobbler, which is what most people think. Cobblers actually repair shoes. Cordwainers make new shoes. So there's a fun fact for you. So that was probably what they're doing at this particular shop. And then these are just the more traditional ones. This one I loved because they're using the oyster shells to make the magnolia flowers instead of just the magnolia flowers, so those oyster shells are going to last longer, which is kind of nice. This is the house where I worked out, the Thurgood House, built in 1718, 1719. Adam Thurgood is considered the founder of Virginia Beach. He was the first one to get a land grant there in the 1630s. This was built by his great-grandson, which is why it's kind of famous for that. They used to say this was the oldest brick house in America, if you've ever heard that phrase from years ago. This arbor, we have two of them, has Yopon holly. So we always like to talk about that in our tours as well. Fun fact, not really dated, but that's what these, based on the images, that's the time period they would be. This is how they used to decorate the house. They used to have a fire going, they used to have all of the live greenery, but we don't do that anymore because, again, we want to make sure the house is protected and we try to keep all bugs possible out of the house. So we actually have purchased artificial greenery from Williamsburg to put up in the house, and that's what we have is the garland, and we focus a little bit more on what they're eating and the tablescape. One of the things that I mentioned earlier with museums is, again, we have to balance what is accurate, but what's going to bring visitors, because we need to have visitors that are coming, because if you have a museum with no visitors, then that museum might as well close because it's not doing its job. So we have to balance that, and part of that is people want to see Christmas decorations, and I call it the Williamsburg effect because in Hampton Roads, we're only about an hour from Williamsburg, so people see Williamsburg, and that's what they want. Every time they come to the house, they ask, do you all wear costumes? We do for special events, but not on an everyday tour. But that's what they're looking for because they have that living history site so close that that's what they expect. So we balance that by giving them that kind of look, but we make sure in our interpretation that we make it very clear that that is not how they would have decorated in 1719. Now we're going to move a little bit further south, a little bit later in the time period, we're going to go into the 1800s. So they're focusing on the entertainment at most of these sites in Charleston, one of which is the Nathaniel Russell House. This was one of the houses that I was able to work at. This house was built in 1808. It is restored to as much of its original appearance as possible. So it is absolutely stunning inside. But what they do on the outside is use these live wreaths. They have live greenery. They actually get that from Abidawile, which is the nursery in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, is where they're getting that greenery from. Usually they're doing that around the beginning of December is when they would actually put that stuff out, around the 5th to the 7th, and that's because it's still warm in Charleston, so if you put too much live stuff out, it's gonna start to wilt pretty quickly. But more importantly, they're doing the inside, and they're doing the dining room table. This woman I wanted to focus on, I wanted to feature. This is Miss Valerie Perry. She is the Assistant Museums Director at Historic Charleston Foundation. She was my mentor when I worked there for a number of years, and if you ever get to these houses and you see her, ask her as many questions as you can because she knows everything there is to know about Charleston history. She is absolutely amazing and the nicest person you will ever meet. But what she's doing is she's decorating this table. You can kind of see a little shininess there, so that's Mylar. Anything that goes on historic tables that is, if it's any kind of material that's not historic on a historic piece, is going to have Mylar to protect it. It's really kind of a plasticky piece, but it's going to protect that furniture. She's using artificial fruit, but she does use a little bit of live material, so they do stuck some sprigs of holly, boxwood, some magnolia leaves that are going to go into those tablescapes. This is another image of it from the nighttime when they had a candlelight tour. Obviously they're electric candles, there's no live flames in here ever. But they're focusing on kind of those decorations. They're using, that is china from the family that was living at the house. They have their china and silver. So you have these beautiful fruit pyramids that are getting put on display. And then sometimes they also do these big dessert kind of pyramids as well. So again, it's very important for the food at this time period. That's what they focus a lot on. So it's all artificial food, but you're seeing, again, there's that Mylar, and you can see the live greenery that they are using. The nice thing about using the little sprigs is if it does start to get wilty or anything, you can easily change it out. But also when you're using the smaller pieces, it's a lot easier to see if there's any bugs coming in. So you can easily kind of control that aspect as well. And their other house that the foundation owns is the Aiken Red House. This is probably one of my absolute favorite museum sites. This one is preserved as found, and it is a later time period. So it's originally built in 1820, but then in the 1830s and 50s, it gets largely expanded to what you see by Governor William Aiken. What's cool about this one, they quickly figured out all that greenery on the piazzas there. They used live greenery at one point, and then they found out very quickly that they get full southern exposure, and it browned up pretty quick. So now they use artificial, just because of that climate in that particular location. But they do decorate with the Christmas tree. So again, Miss Perry, she goes to Lowe's, and she asks them every year for the scrappiest, and that's exactly how she told me. I asked them for the scrappiest tree they have on the lot, and that's what she brings in. So it's not a big full tree like we have, but it's a scrappy tree. They have furnished that with, she's gotten the ornaments from the Smithsonian. She used reproduction ornaments from them. She also went to Germany at one point because she is of German ancestry and visited several of the Christmas markets and brought in ornaments there too that she uses on the tree. This was an ad that's actually from 1857 from Charleston Gazette that talks about decorating the Christmas tree as it's done in Germany with illuminated glass balls and wax candles, which is exactly how they decorate it. So I thought that was very fitting as when I found that actual historic document there. This is the house again. So you see they're focusing also on the table. They do, again, with a little bit of greenery, but mostly it's all artificial food that they're setting the table with. They're using the original silver and porcelain from the family as well, so they do pull those items out that aren't always out on display. And then they're putting up the Christmas tree. But if you notice, I said this house was preserved as found. So you can clearly see this is some new plaster that's been repaired. The walls are very faded. It's very minimally decorated with furniture because there's no climate control. There's one space in this house, let's take that, there's two. The basement, which is where the office and the little gift shop are, that has air conditioning. And the art gallery. Governor Aiken's family went on several grand tours of Europe in the 1800s, and they brought back some of the most gorgeous pieces of artwork, paintings, sculptures that were very popular at that time period. So they have an art gallery that is 100% climate controlled to put those items in. But the rest of the house is not. So you can see the peeling wallpaper. So for a couple years in 2021 and 2022, they did this big Illuminate Charleston celebration. And they partnered with Southern Living Magazine, and they invited in several different artists and decorators to come in and do these little vignettes throughout the house. It was only up for a weekend. So it is live trees and live greenery because it's only for a very short period of time, so they can really control any kind of damage that might happen. But I thought this was beautiful to show all those magnolia leaves on the mantle, the giant trees, but you can really kind of see the house here too. So all of this wallpaper would have actually been gold when it was originally put up in the 1800s, but you can see kind of that fading effect there. And then this is the grand entrance when you come into the house. So it is marble steps, but this is actually all painted wallpaper. It's all faux painting. A lot of faux painting in the 1800s in Charleston. But again, they're using that magnolia leaves, and then they have this greenery. Absolutely gorgeous. They do put some live wreaths on the outside door for the holiday season as well. But a lot of it that's actually in the house is very minimal, or for this special occasion, it's only up for a very short period of time. The Manigo House. This one is interesting to me. This one is owned by the Charleston Museum, so a different organization, built in 1803. But this one has been decorated annually by the Garden Club of Charleston since the 1950s. So 75 years they've been decorating this house for the holidays. They come in and they do use all live materials. But what they do is, I spoke with the person in charge of the education at the museum, and she mentioned that they treat all of the greenery for bugs with some kind of insecticide to protect those. They dip any of the fruits that they're using in wax to preserve them as well for longevity and also for that control. They work closely with the museum staff as they're doing the decorating to make sure that they're protecting all of the building and the furnishings as well. So these are some of the images. They put lots of drop cloths down to make sure that they're making the floors clean, keeping that all protected. You can see there's plastic on the settee there. So they're going to protect as much as they can, and they're going to use as many materials as they can to minimize droppage. So they're going to try to use those materials that are not going to fall apart very easily. These are some of the ones from the past. So they're using that dried okra, cotton, of course, beautiful holly bush leaves there and berries. These are the images from last year, so I just wanted to, all of their materials, similar to Williamsburg, should be recognizable and available to Charlestonians in the early 19th century. But they're going to be more elaborate because Charleston is the most wealthy city in the early 1800s in the country. So they have a lot of money. So you're going to see the big, peacock feathers, all of the beautiful ribbons that are going to be there. Last year's theme seemed to be very green. They had lots of green tones, which I thought was interesting from previous years, which I had all of those pictures too, but then I had to cut it down or else I'd be standing up here for 3 hours. So these are from last year, the different mantles that they're using. Some hydrangea flowers, which are very popular in Charleston as well. And then outside, you're gonna see more palms that they're using in Charleston because they have palm trees in Charleston. You're not gonna see those in Williamsburg ever because if you have a palm tree that's been brought in, it doesn't grow naturally there and it's a lot harder to keep. And then I wanted to include this. This is a historic house, but it's not a museum at all. This is just I think it was listed for probably like 30 million a couple years ago, but the gate is historic. This gate was made in 1850. But I wanted to show it because of the magnolias. And I just love that they take the magnolia leaf and they just flip it. And that gives you that dimension. It gives you more color. It changes the way that entire garland there's wreaths look. And then we move north. And we go to the late 1800s to the Vanderbilts. So the Vanderbilt mansions, immense amount of wealth. It's ridiculous, really, the amount of money that they had. And fun fact, it's completely manufactured as well in the Newport mansions, because the Newport mansions were their summer cottages, so they didn't actually celebrate Christmas there. So the decorations that they use in those museum houses now were created by the staff, and they take inspiration from the room decors, the furnishings, and all of that to create those displays every year, but it's not what they would have used. I contacted them as well. It was Mr. Jim Donahue is their head of horticulture, and he said that because of the longevity and for fire codes, they actually use all artificial trees and garlands in the house. But the poinsettias are all live poinsettias, and they are all grown at their greenhouses from the Preservation Society of Newport County. So they do grow all of those, and they usually grow them from cuttings each year and are able to grow all of those. They use over 1,500 in the house, in their properties. So this is the breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt, Richard Morris Hunt. He is the architect of several of these sites that you'll see, but their big staple is this beautiful poinsettia tree. They're gonna use a lot of poinsettias, and the breakers, they're taking inspiration from these red linens there. So they're gonna use a lot of red tones. This is a little blurry because it was a screenshot that I took from a PBS video that they made. And this is showing that that's the base for that poinsettia tree. That tree is over 15 feet tall, and they use 150 plants to make that tree. So you can see the guy sitting there diligently loading those onto that structure there for that. And then the other end of that room has this, there's kind of a fireplace there, and each year those trees change a little bit. They update, they change the colors a little bit. This year it was super red. They always have the red poinsettias, and they always have these big kissing balls. I saw somewhere that they were, at least one or two of them is 5 feet in diameter. So that's quite a big one that's hanging there from the ceiling. But those are gonna change a little bit. So this one, just red poinsettia flowers. This one has some greenery in it. This is that fireplace again. It's a little bit different with the less red this year. But again, those big, beautiful kissing balls that are gonna be on display there. And then the marble house. The marble house, also Richard Morris Hunt, another Vanderbilt property. But this one is very gold and cream colors because of the marble staircase. Every picture, there's other rooms, but I focused on the staircase because that's their main space that is the feature in everything you see. So they change out, the big wreath changes a little bit, but it's almost always these cream or even some light pink color poinsettias there. They have the big kissing ball sometimes as well. Lots of these kind of jewel tones, lots of the big glass balls for ornamentation because that's a very Victorian time period that they want to kind of show off with lots of ribbons. And then you can see the big white poinsettia kissing ball there as well. And when you look at these images, sometimes it's hard to tell it's different years. And the key is this area here. Sometimes the poinsettia is on the stand, sometimes it's just on the floor. Sometimes they have a little more greenery, sometimes they don't. So that is where you can kind of see those little bit of differences. Biltmore. Also Richard Morris Hunt, and there's that famous landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, designed their gardens. So this is also a Vanderbilt property, but obviously further south in North Carolina, all built between in the late 1890s, 1880s, 1890s. This house uses all live materials inside the house. What is fascinating about this particular site is that they use a 35-foot Fraser fir tree, and they have for a number of years, and I want to make sure, they use Andrews Nursery, which is in Avery County in North Carolina, is who they partnered with for a number of years to get these trees. They used this 35-foot tree because George Vanderbilt requested that for the very first Christmas that was spent in the Biltmore house in 1895. They actually used two 35-foot trees because they changed that tree out halfway through the season. They want to make sure that everybody gets to see the decorations as fresh as possible. So about halfway through, they come in, they take down the old tree, and they put up a new one. And it's a huge process to put these in. You see, it takes 50 people. So this is them bringing in the tree. It's kind of a big event. They have the horse-drawn carriage, they have the big giant tree, people line the walkway to see it, and then they all line up to take it off the truck, 50 of them, with all their sticks to carry it in. They drag it in the house, and then they use lots of roping to hoist it up. But I wanted to highlight this picture a little bit because you see all that plastic? That is covering some very beautiful tapestries that are on the walls. So as they're doing this, they're trying to minimize any destruction to the actual historic house. They have drop cloths up here on these beautiful reliefs so that they can protect all of those as well. Once they get it into place, lots of volunteers and staff that are going to be constantly cleaning and sweeping to keep those floors clean, to get all that material that's fallen. And then we have the final product. big, beautiful tree. And this changes every year. They actually have people full-time on staff that are their force and that come up with these decorations and kind of create the themes that they're going to change out each year. So this is, I thought this was from last year, but then the more I looked at it, I feel like it's from a year or two before that. But I wanted to highlight this especially for you all because they use a ton of holly here on their tablescape, as well as in the centerpieces there also. But this is that room from above. So the big 35-foot tree there. And then this is at the other end, is this beautiful mantle. It's on every year, and they usually have some kind of garland. They change out the tablescape. It always has some kind of beautiful decoration as well for that entertaining that they're going to be doing. You have those fruit pyramids that are super popular as well. Again, in the table there with that, the poinsettias that get put up, all the garland and the lights that they're using at this point. And then this shows you from the other direction how big that fireplace, the full scale of that is, with that big 35-foot tree that's being put up as well. Unfortunately, right now it's closed because of the destruction from the hurricane. They did tell me that most of the house is okay, but they do have a lot of damage to the grounds because they have 8,000 acres of property there, and so they have a lot of damage to the outside. And of course, Biltmore Village, which leads into the house or to the site, has huge amounts of devastation. So the People's House, the most historic house there is in our country, biggest house museum, really. So it's built 1719 or 92, and then it's largely redone in 1814 because the British burned it during the war, so we have to redo it. But the history of Christmas in the White House is interesting. The first Christmas is celebrated, or national kind of Christmas is celebrated by President Coolidge. And then the trees aren't really brought into the house until the Eisenhower administration. So Mamie Eisenhower, this is her tree from 1953. This is the first tree that gets put in this blue room. And this is what starts the tradition of the big tree being in the blue room in the White House. It's I believe most of the trees that are used in the White House display now are live, but I think some of the garlands and stuff are not, or they're artificial, and they reuse a lot of the materials each year. That was something that Michelle Obama put in. When you look at the accounts from the volunteers, they talk about that she instructed to reuse and repurpose as much as possible. So they're trying to do that a little bit more. But I wanted to I have a tree from each of the different decades. So the Kennedy tree is the first to have a theme. Mrs. Kennedy is the one that says each year that White House Christmas is going to have a theme, and that's when it starts in the 1960s for her. But you can also, what's cool about these pictures is you can see the changing of the building. So you notice the big blue wallpaper there, but then later it's disappeared. They've redone the room, and they do it several different times, and you can see that throughout these pictures as well. So we have, this is the Carter tree from 1978, and then we have the Reagans. This one is from 87, Clinton from 97, and then this is Mrs. Bush's from 2006. But you can kind of see the wallpaper and the draperies changing a little bit in each of those as well. And this is the Obama tree from 2009, and then President Trump's tree from 2019. But it's interesting because you can see the different changes in the trees too. So some of them are really fat, some of them are a little bit skinnier, some of them are really kind of proportioned. So this one I liked because it shows the construction of how they're doing this. The floor is completely covered with like butcher paper, protecting those hardwood floors that are original to the house. The centerpiece here is the chandelier. That chandelier is taken down every year before Christmas, and it is put in a crate because it is a historic chandelier. So it is a huge process just to get that chandelier safely removed and put into storage for the holiday season so that they can put up this tree that they attach to that medallion there in the center. It takes over 300 volunteers to do this. They start the day after Thanksgiving, and they work diligently for a solid week. Constant work, and it's something that anybody can volunteer to do. You can apply to the White House to be a volunteer to do the decorating, but it is at your own expense. So you have to pay for your travel and your lodging. They do feed you during the day, but you're working hard too. So it would be a great experience if anybody gets the chance. I finally got the chance to go to the White House last year. I've tried and requested, because you have to go through your congressman. I've requested several times. And I even played the military card. You know, my husband, he retired and he'd never been to the White House. Still couldn't get in, but we finally got tickets last year. So this is the Biden tree from last year in the blue room. Their theme was joy, magic, joy, and wonder. They had over, I think over 29 trees throughout the site. This is the entrance. They made it look like the tree was going through the building, which was pretty cool to see. The Gold Star tree, I definitely want to highlight that. That tree is the first that visitors see when they enter into the tour of the White House for the holidays, and that tree is commemorating any of those service members who die in the line of duty. So any of those families that lose a service member are called Gold Star families. And so this tree is dedicated to them, and it has names and information about them. It's a really very moving experience to see, especially as a military family. And then each of the rooms have a different theme. So you have the East Room, which last year was all Advent calendars, so there was countdowns everywhere, which was really cool to see. And then you have the Green Room. Usually it has green tones. The Red Room obviously has red tones. This is usually where that cranberry topiary is that they talk about every year if you ever watch the HGTV show where they talk about that. This is the State Dining Room. Beautiful portrait of President Lincoln there. A lot of red tones. And then this piece is in their Great Hall. This was Santa Claus and his reindeer were hanging from the ceiling. But what's cool about this from a museum perspective, and I don't know if you all can see it very well, but right here, you can see the hooks. These pieces are all fabricated to fit up there, so nothing is directly attached to the building. So they're not drilling into the ceiling of the White House to hang these decorations. It is a faux piece that has been put there for those decorations. And then you can see the Oval Office right there. We got a picture taken in front of it, which is really cool. So then I want to finish with this last picture. This is actually Mount Vernon. But you'll notice there's this beautiful uplighting on the trees. There's some projector lights on the house there. George Washington would not recognize that for sure. But this is a way to kind of end it with that museum aspect again of what is real, what do people want, what's going to bring people in. So with Mount Vernon, they created this Winter Glow program. It has all these exterior lights. They also have lights at the Breakers Mansion in Newport, whole lighted display on the outside of the house. It's a way to bring visitors in. But when you talk to any of the curators at these sites, one of the things that they will always say is it brings them in, but then they still fulfill the museum mission by teaching them and letting them know what is the actual history of the site. So you're going to see this on the outside, but when you go into the house, it's going to be decorated as it would have been for George Washington in the 1700s. It's not going to have a lot of decorations. It's going to be more focused on the feasting and the parties. But on the outside, you can have this little bit more modern experience. So there's always that balance that we have to play with museums. Do y'all have any questions? I just gave you a whole ton of stuff.
Do you know, is Biltmore just canceling Christmas this year?
They're trying to reopen, but I know it keeps, every update I've seen, it gets a little bit later for it. So they were hoping to get back open by the 15th of October, and now I think it's kind of indefinite. They're more focused on making sure that all of their staff and the surrounding area is safe and that their homes and all of their stuff is good before.
A lot of the trouble is the road. I live in that area.
Yeah.
The roads, you have to go in and put more village, and they just don't have those roads open yet.
No.
So I don't think they're canceling Christmas, but it's gonna be pushed back, so.
Yeah, it might not be because usually that tree, that was the first week in November is when all those pictures were dated. So that's when they usually bring it in. So it might be that it's closer to Thanksgiving or even December. But I know from a financial standpoint, Christmas is a huge moneymaker for them to help them do other programming. So I know they want to get it back open, but it's just the circumstances they can't. You can't move that along any faster than it can.
You probably mentioned this, but when do they actually start decorating for Christmas? Is it like right now, or?
So it depends on the site. So Williamsburg will start usually Thanksgiving is when their stuff will go up, and then they'll have it up through the very beginning of January. Charleston sites are usually, they might do the tablescapes around Thanksgiving, but then the outdoor decorations and more of the Christmassy stuff won't be until that first week of December. And most of these sites will stay up until about January 6th. I know in Virginia, we decorate the first week of December usually, and then we used to have, and we're hoping one of our other museum sites will reopen, and it will have a big 12th night program. So that'll celebrate kind of the end of the season, but most of them are going to be from Thanksgiving through the holiday time.